Hi, and welcome to MindSet, an HCD vidcast, where we dive into the world of applied consumer neuroscience and market research with leading experts in the field. My name is Michelle Nagella, PhD in behavioral neuroscience and Director of Research and Innovation at HCD.
And I'm Catherine Ambrose, the Manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences with HCD. As your hosts, we are going to act as the buzzkills for the buzzwords, taking time to critically think about the limitations and pitfalls of emerging trends and topics within the field to help you identify what innovation has a lot of untapped potential or is too good to be true.
Now, HCD is a full-service research house which provides research capabilities on consumers by looking at how they perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli, such as looking at product experiences, communications, or just general consumer and shopper experiences. We use a combination of tools that come from psychology, physiology, neuroscience, as well as the traditional methods that people typically use to see how they experience different stimuli. That stimuli can range from the early stages of exploration all the way through the final product validation tests. This is what we refer to as applied consumer neuroscience.
So stick around for more curious conversations as we chat our way through the ever-evolving space of consumer science. Hi, everybody.
Hey.
How's everyone doing? How are you doing, Michelle?
I'm doing great. Catherine, how are you?
I'm great. And we are really happy to be back here for MindSet. Today, we're going to be talking about NeuroUX. I don't know if anybody here attended NeuroU, but we really highlighted it there. And we shared a little bit about the case study that we did back in May of 2020, which now feels like so long ago.
Yeah, and it was just to also mention that it was in collaboration with IVP and Schlesinger. And so, we worked with them. And at the time, it was a really interesting question because we were looking at the utility and usability of a website in order to schedule a vaccine appointment, which again, at the time was something that was really hard to do. So before we launch into kind of what that study was about, I think it's good to take a little bit of a step back and, talk about what is NeuroUX. Obviously, there's two parts to it, right? There's neuro and there's UX. So I think the first thing to start with is what is UX?
Oh, okay. You want to start? I was ready to start with what is neuro? So UX, just so everyone has a clear understanding, is really just user experience. It's trying to understand what it's like for a person as they're going through any type of experience, whether that be a product experience, whether that be a website experience. It can be, a wide range of things, but it's a tactic that's often looked at. User research is often used for marketing, but it's also used in product because they're trying to get a better understanding of exactly where the places are that people might be getting tripped up. But the thing is with UX research and the way that it's being done traditionally is that it's very conversational. So it's please tell me.
Very qualitative, right?
Yes, qualitative.
I think another thing, as far as examples go, when people, I think, most traditionally think of what user experience has to do with user research in general, they usually think that you're talking about websites or maybe some computer software of some sort that people have to literally use. So those people are considered users, and then the X is the experience that they're having with it. So you might think about it with people that might be looking at how well people are able to play a video game even, or just to accomplish a task on a website. Can you find the item you want and purchase it, or can you navigate this website to get some information? And I think you can notice in those examples that I just gave that they're very task oriented.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because there are some really, really useful metrics that are used in UX that can help you really get an understanding of the person's experiences like. So for example, how long does it take for a person to get from A to B or to complete a task? Or are they even able to complete a task? So
or were they
all of-
successful at buying your product or finding that information?
Yeah.
And those are very observational, right? So you can literally just take a video or look at the clicks that the number of clicks. So there's a couple of different ways you could do that, right? You could monitor people that are visiting your website to see how long it takes them to do different tasks. You could follow the number of clicks that, the destination, the goal is actually receiving.
Yeah.
Versus how many people just leave the site altogether. So some of that can just be done, very passively, very remotely. But then there's something that could be more hands-on, right? Where you bring people in to maybe run through your video game, or to, you give them specific things you want them to do on your website, and you would do sort of what's called a speak aloud. So can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So a speak aloud it's kind of sounds what it is, where a speak aloud is you're going through the experience of doing it, but also sharing your thoughts as you're going through it. And often sometimes there'll be checkpoints throughout the experience where they will stop you and say, so what are your thoughts as you're doing this? What is happening right now? To really get an understanding. Again, it's conversational, it's talking to that person, it's qualitative, to really see what the person's feeling like, how is it? But again, the drawback there is that it takes the person out of the experience, because obviously they have to answer your question.
So if you're saying, while you're navigating the website and you're saying, well, I'm looking to the left side of the screen and I see an options bar and I'm doing the drop down, like the split that you have to do in your thinking, in your brain, to be able to not only do the task, but also talk about it while you're doing it, probably changes your behavior a little bit, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you just think about what it's like for you to be, let's just Zoom, for example. If you're going on Zoom to get into a meeting, you are going to the page, you're going to click the page, things like that. And then if somebody stops you right before you click start meeting, you go, okay. And then it takes you out. It gives you a moment to be like, let's talk it through. And maybe you were mid thought in your mind and you were interrupted because the person said, all right, so how did you feel about getting to this point? And that can, take you out of, maybe you were confused about something, or you lost your train of thought because you had, you were trying to find another place where the microphone button is, or something like that.
Or maybe you don't actually know what's your hang up, and you're supposed to report on it and you don't really know what to say.
Absolutely.
These are some of the missing pieces that kind of come with traditional UX work. And, as, Catherine was saying before, it doesn't actually have to be a website. It could also be using a hairdryer, or, using an app on a phone, or some new piece of technology, or even navigating how to use the pump on your lotion, right?
Yeah.
All these things are kind of usability. It's how you're successfully or unsuccessfully using a product in the proper way, right? Can you do it? Can you not?
Right. And there's a lot of really great work that comes out of user research. It's, there are some drawbacks, but there's drawbacks to everything. So it is a qualitative approach. You can have a lot of opportunities to find need finding opportunities. And also maybe people find workarounds quite often. So they don't even realize it, but some of the innovations come from those that people make all the time, and
observing what people do to handle a situation. Certainly that can give you insight on how to improve your product, that it makes it easier for people to use, which overall leads to better satisfaction and repurchase, and et cetera, and so on. Yes. So definitely important things to think about. But I think the reason people, why this has neuro attached to it is a lot of times, when we think about doing this type of research, we do want it to be more naturalistic. That's a goal, I think, of a lot of researchers out there, a lot of brands and companies that want to get insights. It's all about naturalistic behavior. And you lose that naturalistic behavior when you have to interrupt and have them answer survey questions, or answer interview questions, or do speak alouds, or whatever it might be. Or maybe even more importantly, try to recall what they felt. So if you have them naturalistically go through the website experience and then you ask them later, they may not exactly remember what the struggles were. So passive measurement ends up being something that can be very useful. So using quote unquote neuro, which could be, actual brain measurements, or it could be physiological measurements, like, looking at heart rates, skin conductance, spatial EMG, any of the things that we've talked about in the past. you could get that passive measure that could show you the ups and downs and potentially point out pinpoint the problem areas, or maybe the good areas, right? And it's not all about problems.
Yeah, exactly. So what's great, and we'll just give a definition really up front, that NeuroUX, the way that we see it, is that it's a way for you to understand how a person's feeling as they're interacting with a system. So that system, like we said, it could be anything from an app to a product to a website. So it's important to keep that in mind, because emotions are fleeting, but also, they're complicated. So it takes a lot off recording. Michelle and I were always talking about how complex we talk about it on the recording, we talk about it off the recording.
The brain is a complex thing. I mean, there's kind of two sides to adding neuro to this, right? So when we are talking about NeuroUX, we're really talking about EEG. So EEG is a measure of brain activity, right?
Yes.
Electrical activity across the scalp. And there's kind of two sides to it, where first you have to appreciate the brain is super complicated. The majority of the brain is involved with keeping you alive. So there's always activity going on, because your heart needs to beat, your lungs needs to fill with air, you need to sit upright, you're awake, your eyes are blinking, all these things are going. You might be digesting food, or maybe you're trying to tell yourself you're hungry so you can go get something to eat. But this is all going on in addition to the emotions that you're feeling, the memories that you're having, the thinking you're having to do to figure something out, like navigating YouTube or whatever it might be. So your brain's doing like a billion different things all at the same time. And I literally do a billion, because you have, in the 3 pounds of flesh, you have 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections among those. So it's a very complicated system with literally a billion things going on at the same time. So how do you sort through that mess? I think it's important to also talk about another analogy that is often used when talking about EEG, which is that it's a lot more blunt than people think as far as a tool. They hear EEG and they think, oh, wow, it's a sophisticated tool for measuring brain activity. It must be very precise and complicated to be able to read the brain. It's not reading the brain. It's actually a very blunt tool. And I like to use the analogy that I've seen before. I can't take credit for it, but it's very much like if you were an apartment complex and you had neighbors above you and below you, and you wanted to hear the argument of people that are having an argument 2, 3, 4 floors below you, you can hear that they're arguing, but you can't necessarily hear what you're saying. That is EEG. It is electrodes on the scalp that's measuring activity that are way below the scalp, right? So you have to go through bone and all the dura mater and all the tissue. And even then you have layers and different structures within the brain doing different things. So it's a blunt tool that just measures activity.
Yes. Yeah. I'm glad that you clarified that too, because it can be complicated, but that's when the design becomes so important. So that way you can have really set boundaries. And if you have a clear research design to try to answer whatever that question is, EEG can be actually really helpful and really impactful. So just to give a little bit of more idea of how the EEG actually helps, the EEG is able to capture those brainwave frequencies, and those brainwave frequencies are actually correlated with certain brain functions and certain brain responses that we are then able to look at and analyze in the context of whatever stimuli they were experiencing. And there's quite a few of them that we tend to explore. One of the most popular ones that I think we have to talk about and address is frontal alpha asymmetry, FAA.
It's a tough one. It's a great one, right? Because it's certainly what people want to know. Is it a good experience or is it a bad experience?
Right.
It's important to note that the EEG is very well locked temporally, meaning that it is a very fast measure. You can look at, nanoseconds of differences, right? But you have a lot of different things going on. And so being able to focus on specific area of the brains, in the case of frontal alpha asymmetry, you're really looking at the front of the brain. A lot of things are going on in the front of the brain. The frontal areas of the brain have a lot to do with decision-making and planning activities and arm movements, even being able to plan, how you're going to reach and grab something, but executive functions, things of that sort, but also some emotional inputs as well. But the complication is it's not just about location in the brain. It's also the type of activity that you're talking about, the type of brainwave. And I know we've talked in the past, if you want to reference back to conversations we've had about EEG, there are the different wavelengths, one being alpha. So can you tell us a little bit about alpha? I mean, we don't want to, dwell on things too much, but.
Yeah. So I don't want to touch too much on alpha, but it's a slower waveform. So it's kind of interesting because the one thing I do want to bring up too is that FAA is also, you may know it if you are doing research in this, it'll come up often as like frontal lateralization, which I think is really important to note because it explains a little bit further why people have certain assumptions that they do about FAA and emotions, because there's this really big misconception that you're left brain or right brain.
Yeah. Neuromyth.
It's a neuromyth. And like Michelle kind of touched on, the brain is working really with itself all the time.
And it is lateralized. You have certain functions that are only on one side and other functions that are only on the other side. Majority of structures are on both sides of the brain, and your activity is not necessarily your personality. So there aren't left brain people and right brain people. There are interesting differences seen in depression, right? Or anxiety that can, show differences in frontal alpha asymmetry, for example. Yeah.
And so the thing that I want to say here is that the way that FAA, the scoring for it is determined is really through the activity that's seen on either sides of the brain, from the left side or the right side. And it's really determined through that frontal hemispheric alpha power. So it's basically that activity that's happening to figure out what the score is and to give an idea of what the effective response is during an experience by then looking at the different activity that's taking place. And so if you have a higher score that actually, according to the FAA theory, is that it implies that there is a more positive response. And then, of course, if you have a lower score, that suggests a more negative response. But I really do want to hone in on the fact that people get confused about emotions because they're so complicated, especially when you're looking at FAA, to keep it in the context of the research. And Michelle, do you want to touch on that a little bit about, because people often say, okay, so if it's a positive affect, that means happy, right?
Right. It's more complicated than that. So again, it's a blunt tool. It's listening in on your floor to your neighbors. So, it's not going to give you specifically what they're saying. You might be able to hear that it's louder or softer, or maybe it does sound more negative or more positive, but is that because they're excited or is it because they're angry? That's more complicated, right? And it's not necessarily something that EEG alone can tell you, or at least that FAA alone can tell you. You have to perhaps look at other measurements within the brain within EEG. Could be engagement level, right? It could be how much effort and cognition that they're putting into whatever it might be, but you should also never do anything in a vacuum. So, when EEG is used in academia, they don't just slap gear on someone's head and call it a day. They also ask them questions. So we don't just leave it at measuring someone passively for their FAA. We're also perhaps asking them, is this more stressful? How are you feeling right now? Was this a complicated task? To get a little bit more understanding over how they're feeling and what's going on. And so it's important to think about that. And that's why it can also be really important how you design your UX study. So rather than having someone just go to a website all by themselves and just sort of aimlessly navigate it, instead to give very specific tasks so that then you can look at their behavior and put it into buckets. And that way you can say, they were specifically trying to do this one thing. We asked them to find a brand on a page. A product on a page, of many different options. And so being able to see that, yes, they are searching for it. You're looking at their eye tracking. They're going all over the place looking for it, and connecting that to, maybe a more quote unquote negative FAA might actually tell you something about their frustration level. So you could interpret that result, that, increase in FAA as being something more, associated with their frustration level. So you have to it's got nuance to it, right? And so your study design and the other measures you're using, like eye tracking, give you that nuance and structure to interpreting.
Yeah. And, you touched on it perfectly, that multiple things can happen at the same time that look similar. So by having that context and having those extra measures really does give us a better understanding of what's happening. And one of the ones that I think is really, it complements EEG really well is eye tracking, because you then can see, again, it's another passive measure, but it's not, you can have an idea of exactly where their visual attention was when they were experiencing maybe a really high negative effect, and say, okay, why is that negative effect taking place there? Because you can have a negative effect that is also engaging, and maybe we're asked to play a game or something. And that could be a good thing. It really is a checks and balances, and there is a nuance to it.
Yeah. Because it could be a negative emotion, like I feel sad versus happy, right?
Yeah.
So, what does it mean to be happy? That's a huge philosophical question, but
I don't know if we're going there on this episode.
We don't necessarily want to go down that road, but there's another way to interpret FFA is motivation, right?
Yeah.
And motivation is something quite different from whether or not you're feeling happy or sad. It's really, do you feel, and it's not motivation in the sense that I'm going to accomplish everything in the world, I'm the king of the world. It's motivation in the sense that I am approaching something or withdrawing from something. So sometimes it's called approach withdrawal. And the easiest way to talk about that is that, let's say you're feeling very negative, right? So you're on the negative end of the emotional spectrum. Well, if you're approaching something and you're feeling negative, you might be angry at it. So you can imagine, if I am encountering some sort of stimulus in the world, I'm feeling bad about it and I'm going at it, it's probably because I'm angry, I'm ready to fight it, right? Yeah. But if I'm retreating from it, I'm withdrawing from it, I might actually be a little more afraid. So that's kind of like that fear versus anger spectrum is a really good example, a good way to talk about whether somebody's approaching something or withdrawing from something.
Yeah, absolutely. Because people will ask, okay, there's this avoidance that's taking place, but we have to ask probably a little bit more and say, okay, why is there this avoidance taking place? Why is somebody not
Is it overwhelming?
Yeah. Why are they not?
You might actually see that, they're overwhelmed. Like the eye tracking may be able to point a little bit to they have no action they're taking. Their mouse is not moving anywhere, but they're looking all over the place. And, if we see that they're sort of withdrawing from it, it could be that it's, frustration in the sense that they're kind of giving up. Right. Yeah. Their motivation towards it, they're wanting to act on it, has gone down, right. Which is another very important way of looking at it.
Yeah. And so one thing I do want to touch on is really quickly is just the other measures that we can get through looking at EEG. And it's really exciting because we have these measures so that way, if it fits, we can look into it and again, really take it in context to see why that was taking place. So this really lets us see that it is taking place. And then having things like behavioral coding or eye tracking or hedonics or different emotional batteries can really help in filling in the gap and making it a really rich experience to learn from.
Another big one for the, particularly UX is of course cognitive load, right? Yeah. How hard. So one of the big tenets of UX is don't make me think, right? So one of the most famous books on the subject is literally called Don't Make Me Think, because everything should be intuitive in your UX. So one of the big sort of key points that you want to do in measuring UX is making sure it's not too difficult. It is intuitive. People don't have to think in order to accomplish their goals. And we definitely saw this as an issue in making a schedule for a vaccine appointment. If you have to think too hard about how to get to the next step, schedule that appointment or to choose a date or choose a location, you might just give up and walk away from it.
Right.
Yeah.
And the thing is, again, it's that same idea with cognitive workload is that if you have a low cognitive workload and but you can still have like a negative affect, people are like, all right, well, what does that mean? Well, if you think a little bit more about it, you say, okay, so if there's cognitive workload is, if somebody is experiencing cognitive workload and then they have a negative affect, that means that maybe they are, like you said, frustrated, or there's extra mental effort that's taking place. Or if you're not seeing cognitive workload, maybe they're just not engaged.
Out. Yeah.
Yeah, they're checked out. They're daydreaming.
Which may be really
about
important
something
if you're
else.
looking at like a game, right? So maybe there's something good about someone being able to perform a task successfully, but not actually having to engage too much in it. But if you're like, say, playing a video game, that might indicate that, you know, the level of psychological flow is poor, right?
Yes.
So if it's not engaging you, then, and it's not challenging you enough, then you may not want to play the game again, because it's actually not fun if
Right.
it's not engaging and if it's not challenging you. So there's like a balance. And that's
You
kind of
want
what we
that-
mean by, you really have to think about context, you know, and what else is going, what is this, a game, or is it, you know, you're just trying to buy underwear online? Like, you know, one is very exciting, the other one maybe not so much, you know?
Right. And we actually see this a lot in advertising too, with things like insurance. It's kind of understood that insurance is not fun. So
Right.
what do advertisers do? They try to create more personas, or they have cute little geckos going around to make it more exciting.
And now there's like the counter, right? Where some of these companies are starting to say, we have no gimmicks, you know,
Yes.
and so we're the opposite of them.
Yes. But really quickly, two other ones that we should touch on is this idea of distraction, which is really just the idea of disengagement from maybe a process they're experiencing, or maybe they're tired. And then also the drowsy and fatigue. So maybe the person missed a response that was popped up on the screen, or there was a delay in interacting with something.
Right. So if they are, you know, say playing a video game, and, you know, sometimes in video games, they have like really long intros to things, and maybe the person's just now getting totally disengaged and drowsy. Well, that's important to be able to measure that this is perhaps going on too long, right? And then when you're thinking about some of these other measures, they may be very important depending on the type of stimulus, the type of, you know, experience that you're measuring. So they don't all have to be measured either, right?
Right. It really depends on what you're looking at. But if you do this type of research well, and you design it well, you are able to then pinpoint places that maybe need a little bit more optimization, or need a little bit more of a visual cue or something like that. If we're going to the CVS example that we did with CVS versus Rite Aid, there were slots that sit like whole states that had nothing available. And so maybe if you had grayed that out, it wouldn't have surprised the person so much, because they would have that information earlier.
Yeah, and wouldn't frustrate them and make it so difficult. Although at the time it was a very difficult thing to do. If you're interested in learning more about the results from that study, we do have it available on the website, and we will have a link below. So, or a link in the description of this podcast. So, you know, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening via the podcast, you can access that study either on our website or in the description. So please check it out, because it's really interesting. We did see some interesting results that told us a lot about the behavior and the difficulty of navigating different websites. But, you know, you can use these things in a lot of different situations, and EEG can be used in a lot of different situations. You know, like we said before, it could be with using a tube of toothpaste, or a, you know, using a kiosk at a store, or, you know, actually with a website. So there's a lot of different applications and different ways that we can do it. But there are, of course, some caveats with that. And I hope that we've reviewed that pretty well. So if you do have any questions, you know, of course, feel free to reach out to, I'm going to put Catherine on the spot. You can reach out to Catherine.
Yes, please. I love talking about this. I love talking about UX. I love talking about neuroscience and EEGs. So please feel free to reach out to me. I am very active on LinkedIn, and I'm more than happy to start a conversation with you. So please reach out. Chat. And
now we're going to put Catherine in the hot seat, and we are going to do a free association game with her called a React Attack. So I'm going to give her some words, and she's just going to tell me the first thing that she thinks. And we have spent all this time talking about UX research. So some of these words obviously are going to be related, but the words themselves could have to do with anything. So, you know, if I say, you know, NeuroUX, she could say pumpkin, and that's totally fine, right? Like whatever you are, first thing that comes to mind is totally okay. No judgments here. Ready?
Let's do it.
Okay. User.
Important.
Website.
User interface.
Virtual.
The new world.
Social media.
Connections.
Navigation.
Journeys.
Frustration.
Something to consider.
Easy.
Intuitive.
Intuitive.
Oh God. Easy.
Thinking.
Don't make me.
EEG.
Cool.
All right. So that wraps it up. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Good
Awesome.
job.
So thank you. Thank you. I love doing those. It's a lot of fun. And like I said before, we are more than happy to chat with anybody. If you're interested in NeuroUX or you're just interested in EEG, we have a white paper on EEG that we're more than happy to share, but we can talk about this for hours. So before we do that, we'll let you go for this time. And
thank you so much for listening in, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
HCD Mindset is produced by Helen Ross. For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you, and stay tuned for more curious conversations.